Good morning, everyone. Dumelang. Welcome to today's Justice learning event. My name is Lesego Moshikaro-Aman, and I am an economist at TIPS, and I will be your chair for today's session. So this is the Justice second learning event. There was the first one held, which was last year in November, and that event was looking at the coal value chain and also coal mine workers in this transition away from coal. And so in today's second learning event, the focus will be on what next for coal miners, workers, as well as the community. So it's going to focus on economic diversification and the identification of diversification opportunities in the Mpumalanga coal fields. So the aim of the event today is to showcase the work that's being done across TIPS by the Justice colleagues as well as TIPS colleagues, also through the UK-funded research that is looking to deepen support for just transition in South Africa. So today we have 4 presentations from TIPS. So first of all, I will take 2 presentations from Michael and Jill, and I will allow for a question. And then after their presentations, I will take the presentations from Kate and Ndombi. And then we will have a discussant by Mohammed. And then after that, we will open up for Q&As and having our discussion. So for the participants who are online, you are welcome to post your questions in the chat, and then we can look at those questions after the presentations, but also during our Q&A. And I think without much further delay, I'd like to hand over to our first presenters, who is Dr. Michael Hector, who is an economist at TIPS, and Gillian Chigumira, who is a senior economist at TIPS. So both colleagues have extensive knowledge and expertise in the agricultural sector, as well as in inclusive industrial policy. Michael, over to you. You have 10 to 15 minutes for your presentation. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Lesego, for the wonderful introduction. So I'll be taking you through the Sector Jobs Resilience Plan, or SJRP, for the agriculture value chain. Now, just a short overview of the project. So it falls part of a project between TIPS and UK-PAC in updating the National Vulnerability Assessment and the SJRPs for agriculture, autos, metals and mining, and the coal value chain. And it's related to climate change impacts and the impacts on the sector and most obviously labor. So the purpose of the agriculture SJRP is essentially designed to mitigate the adverse effects as they relate to climate change, especially on vulnerable groups in the sector, which I'll get to in a moment, specifically the farm workers, small-scale farmers, and household gardeners in historic labor-sending regions or historical traditional areas. So it outlines 5 strategic areas, that being climate adaptation, economic diversification, active labor market policies, and social protection policies, and then the institutional drivers. My focus today will primarily be on climate adaptation and economic diversification. So just some background on some of the findings from the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment for the agriculture value chain. So in 2024, we see that around 840,000 workers were employed in the agricultural sector, primarily seasonal workers that are very much in a vulnerable position. And employment is largely concentrated in KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape, as we see those 2 provinces provide around 40% of the GVA for the agro-industrial sector. And we also see a high concentration of household agricultural activities, primarily in backyards in provinces such as Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, and Limpopo. And most of these activities are backyard gardening. So in the study, it shows that these individuals or households do not necessarily own farmland in the commercial sense. But we also need to remember that the agricultural sector is one that is shaped by historical suppression of African agriculture, specifically under the apartheid system, which has resulted in a dual system in South Africa. So on the one end, we've got a very much a commercialized, internationally competitive agricultural sector. And on the other side, we see very much marginalized households and small-scale farmers who lack the ability to adapt to climate change, specifically in adopting climate technologies. So in terms of the vulnerable groups, farm workers, we see them being highly vulnerable to climate change, things like heat stress. In the event that farms close, they could face the risk of losing their jobs because their jobs are tied to, their housing is tied to their jobs or continued employment on these farms. So if they do lose their jobs, they also face eviction. So it's a very complex situation. And this is coupled with things like low education levels and skills, which makes it difficult for them to transition into other forms of work. And then what compounds this is that there's very low levels of unionization among farm workers, but then also their social and geographic isolation essentially reduces their access to services and rights services, primarily because of many farms in rural areas specifically are very much in remote areas. Sorry, So one of the primary questions within the SJRP is who's essentially responsible for driving the SJRPs? So the primary proposal of the Agri-SJRP is the development of a sector adaptation strategy for the agricultural value chain. So it presents two options. The one option is to create a national steering group or working group that is to develop the sector adaptation strategy, drive implement or guide implementation, act as oversight with the PCC acting as an advisory body. The other option is for implementation to occur at a provincial or municipal level. And for it to be coordinated through the existing provincial intergovernmental forums, and perhaps to have the SJRPs integrated within municipal IDPs. So the overall goal here is to leverage existing institutions with existing mandates. And this is largely based on the fact that a lot of municipalities and provinces lack the resources which could make responding to climate change a lot more difficult. So the overall goal here is then to have cooperative governance being essential for successful implementation of the SJRP. So the SJRP also outlines for various primary actors within the sector the benefits, costs, and risks. The benefit, costs, and risks here is just a sort of snapshot of what is in the larger paper. Unfortunately, there was not enough space in the slide to add every single stakeholder. So the first proposal within the SJRP relates to climate adaptation. So it calls for, as noted earlier, development of a agri-sector adaptation strategy, and within the strategy to incorporate the SJRPs. However, what will be important here is that a focus on climate data improvement, specifically gathering data on existing initiatives, where the shortfalls are, where the weaknesses are in climate change adaptation, especially amongst households in historic labor-sending regions and small-scale farmers. And this is very much important in terms of climate data because the capacity or ability of farmers, whether they be commercial or small-scale, relies on their ability to adapt to climate change. So they rely on accurate climate data. Although the South African Weather Service has meets international standard, there are still some constraints surrounding the dissemination of data, access to the data, especially by small-scale farmers. And one of the deep dives by one of our colleagues focuses further on that. And essentially, what is argued here in the SJRP is that adequate data is fundamental to municipalities, to provinces, to small-scale farmers in responding to adaptation measures, to responding to insurance. The next proposal relates to economic diversification. So in the context of climate change and the implementation of the SJRPs, economic diversification involves broadening the range of viable economic activities that are available to local communities, especially for farm workers or former farm workers, and also small-scale farmers. However, Achieving this will require targeted investments in things like skills, or skills development, capacity, the development or the improvement of local infrastructure. So there are a number of opportunities in terms of economic diversification in areas like Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape. Those were identified in the NEVA as the primary areas that are the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. So here the question is, or the proposal rather, is to assess available on-farm and off-farm activities. And I put a little star next to crop diversification and also agritourism. Although they are viable and they have proven, and research has shown that they are internationally viable as options for economic diversification, agritourism, for example, is highly dependent on commercial success of farms, and then also the type of farms. Most likely horticulture farms around the Western Cape region, perhaps KwaZulu-Natal, wine farms, fruit farms, etc. Less viable on a maize farm or a livestock farm, specifically if you're looking at rural areas, because a lot of this is based on the surrounding areas. But then also the question comes in on the viability for agritourism around whether or not those areas have a robust tourism sector. So there's a lot of things to consider when looking at agritourism as a economic diversification strategy for farm towns. The other option might be more viable in many areas, like crop diversification or crop switching. Now, we see things like multi-cropping, integrating different crops, integrating crops with livestock, for example. So there's a number of options in this. However, this depends heavily on the specific capacities of these farmers, of the areas, of the regions. And this is essentially reliant on financial support, input support. So these are not short-term things that we can decide today that this is what we're going to do, and eventually, by next week, you've got a diversified farm. These are long-term decisions that need to be made. And it's a long-term process because it changes the inputs that are provided. It changes the type of support that is provided, whether it's financial support, input support, skills development, etc. So we need to think carefully about the options in the context of these areas like Mpumalanga. And we have to decide on economic diversification options that are sustainable in the long term. It's not something that could be started today and then finished by the end of the year. So very much a long-term thing, especially in traditional areas that are and small scale farmers that face a myriad of challenges. So I'm not going to spend too much time on active labor market policies and social protection, even though my heart is burning and I really want to. But the paper also outlines proposals for active labor market policies and social protection policies that should be developed in tandem with economic diversification, because these active labor market policies rely heavily on economic growth within those areas. They would cease to be effective if farm workers, for example, do not have an alternative option to go and work. So it's not just skills development, it's also about economic growth within these areas. So essentially, workers will need to be protected, reskilled, and or upskilled. The paper outlines options such as redeployment within food processing. What's the viability of that? Consideration for relocating farm workers in the event that climate change in these areas gets so bad that farms have to close and the workers are left without any means of livelihood. So consideration needs to be given to these what ifs as they relate to climate change, and how to support not only the farm workers, but also the small scale farmers and the options available to them. We need to start thinking around what happens if farm workers, even if they are skilled, they might be at retirement age, they might have certain disabilities that would not allow them to transition into other forms of work. So the Agri-SJRP also highlights the need to improve the grant system to be more akin to or linked to climatic events. So it introduces the options around biometric insurance systems, improving these systems for households and small-scale farmers, so that in the event of a drought or a flood, that municipalities, provincial governments are able to respond and support the most at risk or vulnerable people. So that being said, in terms of climate change adaptation, my esteemed colleague Gillian did a deep dive on the tech diffusion, especially among small-scale farmers, and how they have responded and what needs to be done. And she'll be focusing on that paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Natasha, I'm just going to ask you to, next slide, please. So this was a deep dive from, as Michael said, from the SJRP, and it was looking at technology diffusion for small-scale farmers. As Michael already said, climate change has intensified vulnerabilities in the agricultural sector. Thank you very much. And then, so what's very important, I think, is to incorporate the role of tech and innovation as we look at the topic for today in driving economic diversification efforts and the just transition. Next slide, please. And so if we just look at what's happening in Mpumalanga, so we just isolate in Mpumalanga, but this looked at the whole of South Africa. Mpumalanga accounts for about 10% of total agricultural small-scale farmers and households. And if we just split them there, as you can see with the first graph, 84% produce mainly for consumption. So you can imagine the impact of climate change on that group of people. And then just think of the impact of climate change as well for those who produce mainly for sale and mainly sales and consumption. And so you're looking at vulnerabilities of food insecurity. You're also looking at loss of income and inability to reinvest and slow recovery. And then just thinking also for the topic for today, diversification. This is by production in Mpumalanga. So a lot of people produce, small-scale farmers produce livestock, crops and grains, and then followed by fruit, vegetables, and some are combined. And so when you're looking at diversification, for example, into livestock, you will have to take into accountability the role of technology because of the effects of the heat stress. As I spoke to the University of Pretoria, because of the heat stress, it used to take about 12 months for a cow to have a calf. Now it's taking 18 months. And so you can just imagine some of just the great impact of climate change. Next slide, please. And so just looking into some of the technology innovation and practices that helps to mitigate climate change. So this is not all of them. This is just some of them. And this is also by level. So whether it's low, medium, high, or advanced, I think all of it serves a purpose in the just transition as well. And so be it climate smart practices, even netting that protects against heavy hail and windstorms, which are common in Mpumalanga, or also even the use of advanced products such as hydrogel polymers, which just help to absorb moisture in the soil during drought times. And I think a big one that has been government and private sector has put effort in is your biotechnology and gene editing, in just trying to make more drought resilient varieties of crops and disease-resistant livestock. And also vaccines as well. I included these because of the issue of just the growing number of diseases and pests due to climate change and just, diagnostic kits that can be used by small-scale farmers. And then also even climate smart equipment, if you think of with all the heat, delaying ripening, if you want to export, for example, your ethylene absorption packaging, and as well as agromatology applications and apps for better forecasting. Next slide, please. And so one of the questions was, do small-scale farmers have access to technology and innovation? So there is a number of range of innovation in South Africa for such technologies, but it is highly skewed to large-scale farmers. I must say there is a lot of public and private research, but this is largely fragmented. And so to really show a cumulative effort is a little bit difficult. So nationally, the government does collect data on large-scale farmers and their use of agricultural technologies. For example, those using precision agriculture, air and soil sensors, or for example, AI and robotics. And so what we've seen there with the map on top there, you can see that in provinces such as the Northern Cape and Northwest, large-scale farmers mainly use a lot of this tech to impact climate change. And then you have a lesser use, for example, in KZN and Mpumalanga. So as I said before, there's a lot of research that's been done, but as I said, it's in pockets. So we are not really able to get an aggregate. But yes, there has been some studies, for example, in precision farming, but it all boils down to that there are disparities in the uptake for small-scale farmers. Next slide, please. And so what this slide looks at is initiatives that have been taken by government, industry, and academia. And so I spoke to a number of them, not everyone in South Africa. I think the big ones were TIA, the ARC, SA growers, and then also your academia, for example. UP has a big program in the biotechnology and FABGO in Limpopo. And so but all of them combined together, there has been efforts in trying to roll out either it's low, medium, high tech. And as I said before, even your low tech, such as conservation agriculture, is still very important. And especially also the high tech. Mpumalanga I've just finished a paper on aquaculture. It's the third largest province in freshwater aquaculture. But because of the heat stress as well, that's just been a roller coaster with the Nile fever. And so just the test kits that have been developed have been such a huge milestone. And remember, because of the droughts, the natural grazing lands are finishing. And so just think of feed. Farmers end up having to buy molasses, and then it increases the cost of feed. And so R&D into alternative feeds, for example, with the black soldier fly have been quite important. And especially also government and private sector providing drought-resistant cuttings, especially for sugarcane, both in Mpumalanga and KZN. And again, in Mpumalanga, there's a lot of timber. So there's also been DNA fingerprinting just on the trees and which ones are resistant, and just trying to give small-scale farmers the right propagation systems. And also, I think a big one as well is the support apps software. For example, the biosecurity app is probably my favorite, because then there is some real-time alerts and response to some of the climate change and diseases happening. And also, if you think about it, if you're going to use technology, either it's self-discovery, you as the farmer, or change agents. And all our change agents, as I said, it would be the public or private sector NGOs. And one that has been shown to produce more results is technical demonstration and on-farm participatory trials, where farmers actually get to see the difference. And also some of the theory-based training, be it transfer courses. I know the Citrus Growers has a academy in Sasri under the sugarcane, and they've just been putting effort also to train government extension officers. There are also some farmer support centers. I saw one in the farm in Limpopo, just also advocating for sustainable farming and teaching people there. Next slide, please. So nearly done here. So some of the major constraints, and it's on both sides. So it's either constraints in diffusing innovation and technology to farmers, or what farmers face. So this is a combination of findings from government and public sector and private. A big one was the institution and policy constraints. As I said before, there is a higher level for people to adopt if they have access to extension officers who are equipped in climate smart education. And so we've seen a decline from about 2,200 in about 2008 to 1,900 in 2024. However, the government had committed to about 10,000 by 2024. So if you split the ratio of about 2 million households just by 1,900, it's practically 1:2. It's big numbers there. And then if we also think of infrastructure constraints, one of the issues, how do you teach drip irrigation if I don't have access to water? And so another thing, if you're even using drone technology, because of unreliable connectivity and limited batteries as well, it's very difficult in aging infrastructure. A big one was also financial affordability and barriers. So your large-scale farmers have access because they're paying levies to the associations, but just think of your small-scale farmers there. And also a big issue was profitability concerns. There was one study that said just trying to put a machine packing, for example, an automated one, just costs so much money for having the app, having to pay for the app and the upkeep, as opposed to him having his farmers pack the fruit. So it's also an issue of scale and efficiency and affordability. And then also knowledge, skills, and gaps. Just interpreting some of these predictive models on your app, I personally find it difficult. So it was one thing they also found. And just most of the extension farmers are also generalists. And it was also an issue of having specialized in animal health as well. And then just drawing from the DSI CST Large Business Survey, one of the things I found interesting was that even large-scale farmers, only 32% knew of the government facilities for innovation. And so this is definitely something they'll need to speak about more. And I think the last one for me is because of climate change, you have a lot of shift in the routes for migratory birds. And so this increases the spread of avian. And so it really does complicate some of the vaccination scheduling in this regard. And I think these are the things we just have to adopt and adapt with the apps as the birds move. And then lastly, just some of the pathways. I think Michael also spoke about the data issue, just collating that, methods of diffusion. Think about it, small-scale farmers, who do they see every single day? It's your agri-dealers, your tractor providers input. And so one way also diffusing is to speak with people they interact with, and then also just public-private partnerships in terms of standardizing climate change training for extension officers, and also leveraging for the mandatory agricultural statutory levies and just channeling and directing some of these to access for innovation. And so in conclusion, I think, yeah, it's vulnerability is there in agriculture, especially in climate change. Although there have been some efforts, as I said, it's very difficult to find a cumulative because of the fragmented data. But I think essentially as we integrate technology and innovation to sustain inclusive diversification, it's just very important to really consider it in the just transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian and Michael, for the insightful presentation on the agricultural value chain. I'm just going to open the floor up for just one question. If there's any burning questions or any question of clarity, happy to take it. Yes, Thierry. Please introduce yourself before asking your question.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for your presentation. This is Chere from Just Transition Labor Center here at TIPS. My question is a simple one, particularly when you're talking about sector vulnerabilities. Did we get any data or information from trade unions about how they see the situation? And the second one is that I didn't notice the agri-sector been mentioned as one of the key stakeholders. I mean, particularly when it comes to the question of skills development for farm workers. So those are just my two questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Thierry. Joel, Michael?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Yes, agri-sector, there is a section in the paper as well that highlights agri-sector as one of the actors. I think it's in the annexure. Very specific actors is just, it's in the larger paper, but there's also a deep dive into active labor market policies on for farm workers, sorry, that's being focused on. I can't remember the second you had as. Oh yes, trade union involvement. I'm not sure if you've got hold of anyone. We've tried on our side, but just due to time, we had to rely on some qualitative things. But there is an acknowledgement that unionization is low amongst farm workers. The deep dive also touches on that and how and what we need to do around service centers and especially in rural areas and having or getting farm workers to get access to that. It was something that was mentioned, but to my knowledge, there isn't a lot of farm worker focused unions. There's a lot of NGOs which we've been in touch with and working with them in terms of the deep dive for farm laborers.
My one addition is that I know there was a challenge, especially for farmers who were unionized or in an association or corporation. They had better access to extension services as opposed to those who didn't. So that's just the one of the findings when it comes to that. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. So the next presenter is Kate Rivett-Connick, and she is an external consultant with expertise in areas of economic development, tourism, as well as the green economy. So Kate's presentation will be focused on tourism and potential diversification opportunities for Mpumalanga, and Kate will be online. Kate, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Perhaps just to say that this is a piece of research I'm sharing that I did in the first half of last year, but I've also written for TIPS, an economic vulnerability assessment and sector jobs resilience plan for tourism more generally, which looks at sort of the country's tourism trends, risks related to climate change, and some potential strategies to protect jobs. This is a very specific piece of work I did last year I'm presenting now. I'm not actually even going to take you through the methodology. I'm just going to share some findings with you. And I want to start off talking about tourism in Mpumalanga and then the coalfields, a little bit on post-mining tourism, and then move into coalfields tourism potential. So perhaps the first thing to say is that, that tourism, of course, is a big sector in South Africa. We all recognize that there were more than 750,000 direct jobs attributable to tourism, and we often say that they're another equivalent number for indirect and induced jobs, quite diverse across the country, spread. In Mpumalanga, you can see in the top left graph, there were in 2023 about 3 million overnight domestic trips, and about 1.8 international tourist arrivals in that year. That's since gone up to about 2 million foreign tourists in 2024 and 3.2 million domestic overnight trips in 2024. So domestic tourism is more significant. It's interesting to see that the spend lines, those are the two lines in the top left graph, show that equivalent spend in 2023. And that's because much of the foreign tourism or international tourism into Mpumalanga is from Mozambique, and then also Eswatini, and you can see those data points in the bottom graph. So you can just see the source markets there. So that's just an important thing to know about tourism in Mpumalanga. If we look a little bit now more at tourist attractions and what drives tourism, you can see in the top left picture that the main tourist attractions, this is in terms of South African Tourism's departure survey, where they interview foreign tourists, they all visit, not surprisingly, Southern Kruger and then the Panorama route with the sort of iconic attractions around there. You can see that the tourist attraction most or closest towards the coalfields is Dullstroom that features, but in the coalfields itself, none of the sites there feature in the top 20 visitor attractions in Mpumalanga for foreign tourists. And the jobs data confirm this. In the bottom left corner, the spatial tax data set for 2014, and then again 2023 shows us that the jobs in tourism are really in eThekwini, and that we've just taken art, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food service jobs as a proxy for tourism jobs. So tourism is not significant in the coalfields, and I think we probably all would have guessed that. But there is actually quite a lot of tourism in the sense of business travel, because of course they're sort of quite vibrant economies in some of the towns. You have some visiting friends and relatives tourism. We talk about VFR, and of course you have local recreation, because you have quite big and in some instances affluent populations, particularly in places like Middelburg and eMalahleni. Okay. And when I looked at the research, and you can look at the bottom right-hand map, I really focused a bit on two clusters, which were the most interesting, a Middelburg and eMalahleni one, and then the second one being around Ermelo with Chrissy's Mere. And I'll come back to that. Just moving, sort of taking a step back and looking And can I just say there's a policy brief and a really kind of quite detailed report available on TIP's website. I'm roaring through this presentation, and I apologize, but there's a lot of research that you might be interested in on this, including detailed case studies. But just briefly, if we look globally, post-mining sites typically fall into, and their rehabilitation fall into community and culture, then conservation and ecosystem services, and then non-intensive recreation. Of course, tourism feeds off the top two as well, in the sense that when you have cultural sites, museums, arts, event spaces, they pull tourists in, and critically also wildlife habitat improvements and wetlands also draw cards for tourists and visitors more generally. So, you know, tourism is a big feature of post-mining sites, particularly in Europe, where there's a lot of research, in North America, in South Africa. And I saw that Megan Cole is in the audience, and it's so great that you are, and your report, Dr. Cole, with your colleagues is excellent on mine closure risks and opportunities. So it was really nice to be able to draw on that a bit. But we see that post-mining land use is agriculture, forestry, intensive recreation, and non-intensive recreation. And of course, we have examples in South Africa already of post-mining tourism. Perhaps just to note that this is not coal mining, so it's gold and diamonds, perhaps easier to commodify as a tourist experience. But we have the Gold Reef City, which, as we know, is part of a much bigger tourism complex, which probably derives most of its income from casinos and then the conferencing and hotels, where the gold experience is a smaller share. Cullinan diamond tours, which are relatively small, but exist nonetheless. And then for Kimberley, the Big Hole is a very important asset. It's the kind of the key driver of tourism or leisure tourism to that place. And Pilgrim's Rest, also amongst sort of the tourist attractions that feature in the research. Unfortunately, and I don't know what the status is as of today, but certainly a year ago, it was almost closed down due to illegal mining and insecurity in the area, which was devastating for the tourism and broader economy. I looked at 4 case studies in the paper. As I said, there's a lot of detail on this, and I don't have much time. But the 2 on the left, the Nord-Pas-de-Calais in northern France and the Ruhr region in Germany, massive regional development, upgrading, rehabilitation programs over decades. They both started moving away from coal minings in the last century. They've tried different kinds of stakeholder packs, different kinds of levels of top-down and bottom-up development planning. And tourism is a major force in these economies now. Again, a lot of it has been around culture, event spaces, local recreation. And the top one, the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, interestingly has a Louvre museum. So the Ministry of Culture in France decided to decentralize some of these iconic museums. And the one in Lens, which is the town in that region, was the first one outside of Paris. It doesn't make money itself. It's a loss leader. It's an important attraction for the area. There are lots of interesting and fun examples of how they've redeveloped slag heaps. I mean, they have ski runs, they have hiking, walking trails. They even have, in the French one, they have a special kind of vine they're growing and making wine. So lots of innovation, and as I said, over many decades. The example of Indonesia it's more reliant on tourism than other industries and redevelopment than the 2 European ones, where there's lots of other innovation and industry post-mining. But they have seen a decline in unemployment due to the investment in culture and tourism. And let me say that those 3 are all World Heritage sites, so they've been recognized as globally significant due to their cultural heritage and mining. But the challenge in Indonesia, based on the literature, is in part lack of funding and lack of diversification of the local economy. And then the example in Poland is really just interesting as a counterpoint, because they are looking at closing down this enormous coal complex in Poland, also in the 2030s. I understand the Belshul power plant is responsible for the greatest share of CO2 emissions in the EU. And they're looking at leisure tourism as one of the key areas to invest. And here based on the literature I could find, they're looking at 2 lakes in the pits, accompanied by recreation, tourist and cultural centers. They're also looking at a 760-meter ski route. And so that's quite interesting. And the other point that I thought was pertinent for my study was that they're really aware of what the local population in Lotz and Warsaw is like, because they want to attract them, and because it's aging, they're going to look at wellness and spas. So just that was just a very brief overview. And just to now try and pull out some lessons quickly. I mean, across these sites, it's key that substantial institutional support, environmental remediation, and then, of course, marketing and publicity is critical. Another thing that we know from tourism generally is that proximity to markets is really important. Tourists come to the sites, they must be able to get there, and the closer they are, the better. It's easier for them to visit. And so many of the sites that have seen tourism as a driver of post-mine development have strong domestic and quite local populations. In South Africa, while we've seen a lot of private sector investment in those 4 examples I gave, generally you have to have a significant amount of public sector investment, of course, environmental remediation, infrastructure redevelopment, and this kind of idea of broad institutional support with development pacts and coordination is typically driven by the public sector. And then major repurposed facilities, and I gave the example of the Louvre Museum in Lens, they can often not be commercially viable, even in a European context where you have these very deep middle-class markets close by. So it's really important if we enter into post-mining tourism with an iconic cultural center and conference center, etc., that we recognize that investment will probably not be commercially viable, but what it can do is be a draw card and stimulate the economy. Along those lines, the more you can do to attract different visitor markets, different times of the year, the better the resilience of your tourism economy. And so multiple interests and activities can do that. And then just like with other sectors, it takes time for these new tourism clusters and destinations to emerge strongly. And it takes time to see the private sector innovation and investment on top of, if you like, the foundations that the public sector often has to be involved in. I did an assessment of the coal fields. You can see the towns I looked at down the left, and I tried to identify major attractions. I then looked at online accommodation listings. Just very briefly, there is quite a lot of accommodation, particularly in the towns, but much of it is not branded hotels because the market just doesn't warrant it. It's too small scale. So you have lots of guest houses with business travelers staying in them, often routinely returning to them. You don't have any really exciting or very few exciting restaurant and food options. It tends to be more branded franchises, catering again to the domestic market, working in the area or moving through. Ermelo and Christmasmere are more interesting in terms of attractions. In the east, where you do have some farms, you have the Mealie Pop event in Lothair, you have Christmasmere with the lakes. There's more leisure tourism potential there. In fact, when I asked stakeholders in Emalahleni and Middelburg about tourist attractions, they struggled to even identify one. The strategies for tourism and investment in tourism talk strongly about cultural heritage in the region. And although there are important cultural heritage sites, they're typically not very well developed and they don't offer much of a visitor experience. And we know that the iconic Botshabelo, which is just north of Middelburg, in fact, is no longer operational. And that was an important stop for tour groups. Now what we see is that on the maize farm, just near Middelburg, Corn and Cob, they have very cleverly set up in Ndebele Cultural Village, and they provide a restaurant with meal for groups. So in fact, when I went there, there were a couple of tour groups in a bus and then a smaller vehicle. So that's become the stop en route to the Kruger for people who land in Joburg. And then the key opportunity is really around the dams. So these are used by local people recreating, but you've got dams, they're already angling and boating. They just haven't been developed as opportunities for tourism. Moving through quite quickly now, I think what's important to note is that actually the coalfields is very well situated for tourism, particularly domestic tourism, and then also foreign tourism en route to Kruger. But if you look at its proximity to Johannesburg, you've got Mbombela, you've got Eswatini in Mozambique, you've got people moving in and around the area as well as local populations with some income. And so that's something to be capitalized on. There is some level of coordination between the tourism firms, particularly in Christmasmere, for example, a little bit on Ermelo, less so, although they are represented by the Chamber in Middelburg. It's not a major focus at the moment, perhaps understandably. And we know from other research that Emalahleni, Steve Schwete and Msukaligwa all have strong agglomeration characteristics, which is good for a recreational base in the area. Illegal mining is something that came up routinely in my research as a real barrier and a challenge. And then, of course, pollution, not just of the air, but of water sources. And as I said, if we want to think about dam tourism, then not just the ecology, of course, critically important, but if we want to attract tourists, it's got to, and visitors more generally, who want to make sure those sources are safe. And I did a bit of a segmentation of markets and potential experiences to think about how one could attract different tourists. This is quite a pragmatic approach to understanding what potential exists. I'm not going to go through it, but you can see on the left for both of those clusters, a lot of it is provincial tourists, even local recreation. So tourism sometimes is a funny concept because to be a tourist, you have to have an overnight trip and be away from your normal environment. But actually local recreation is at least as important. And so one needs to think about a visitor economy and how one combines the two. But there are opportunities, as I said, around dams, more events, supporting the emergence, and there already is an emerging leisure economy around Ermelo and Chrissy'smere. They've got wedding tourism there. They've already got some ecotourism. And there might be potential for innovation funding, for example. And my last slide is just talking quickly about some of the enabling conditions. So, you know, the international examples I looked at were really the sort of big redevelopment around an anchor attraction at mines that have closed. And that is one way one can think about tourism. But there's also the example of agritourism in South Africa, which, as Michael correctly said, is by no means a viable opportunity for many farms, but it has emerged in places. And what we know there is really about enough SMMEs in a cluster that create a destination effect. So one can think about coalfields, tourism, economic diversification in both ways, and they're not mutually exclusive. So I think it's entirely possible to do both. But fundamentally, one has to deal with the pollution in the area and much like we've seen in Europe and elsewhere, really enhance those landscapes. Address, in our case, illegal mining, mine prospecting and land contestation on biodiverse lands. And that has links to safety and security, which are critical for all tourists and visitors and residents, of course. And then improve some of the infrastructure services in some areas. And then on the tourism side, it's about supporting the agency of tourism players to organize themselves, to upgrade their sector, giving them access perhaps to some innovation finance for experiences, supporting the interactions between government and private and then together with community, removing some of the barriers for SMMEs. I haven't spoken about it much and it's not a focus of my study, but the fact that Esther Mahlangu comes from Middelburg area, I think that kind of taking a design motif, aesthetic approach to regional branding could be really fantastic for locals and the visitor economy, thinking about those Ndebele patterns. So there's some creative things that could be done. And the crafts and design sector is really great for including local people, local employment, local women in particular. And then we need better data on the markets, as well as improved government capabilities. And my final point is just to say that while tourism cannot replace coal mining, it could be part of an economic reorientation of the region, supporting SMEs and new clusters of development. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kate. That was a very interesting presentation. So our last presentation is by Ntombi Chabalala, who is an economist at JUTS, and her presentation will be looking at supporting the development of an economic diversification strategy for Komati Ward 4 region. Ntombi?
All right, morning everyone. Thanks Lesego for the introduction. As Lesego said, I'll be presenting a summary of our draft on the report we've written on supporting economic diversification strategy in the Komati region, which falls under the Steve Tshwete local municipality in Mpumalanga. Also, this work is work that we're doing in parallel with economic diversification work under JUTS that we're doing for the entire coalfields of Mpumalanga. So just to take you through the contents of what I'll be covering, we've got an introduction which essentially covers the problem statement and the purpose of the work we did, the methodology and some challenges and opportunities that we identified in terms of what's hindering diversification, but also what can be leveraged to support diversification in Komati. And then we also look at the key findings and recommendations. So let's start with the introduction. Our problem statement is that after the Komati power station was closed and the mines were also subsequently closed, there has been an increase in economic vulnerability, particularly in terms of unemployment. And there have been several initiatives that have been developed to support the local economy in the area, but they are occurring in the absence of an established economic diversification strategy. So our purpose was to support the development of the strategy, but also to identify certain opportunities or activities that can be diversified into. I also do want to mention that the work that we're doing doesn't go further into assessing the feasibility of the options, but we did conduct a lot of qualitative and quantitative analysis to support our findings. So the target area, Komati area is really small. The population is between 3,000 and 4,000 people. So it was too small for us to develop a strategy for that area on its own. And then when we went further to look into Ward 4, also pretty small, around 10,000 people. So what we did is that we then expanded our focus to include the whole of Steve Tshwete local municipality as a proxy. So that's mainly for our quantitative analysis. We were only able to find data on the Steve Tshwete municipality because data isn't available that's disaggregated at the ward or Komati level. And then our methodology, so we used a three-pronged approach in our methodology. We first conducted desktop research where we looked at various socioeconomic indicators in Komati and in the municipality, and we were able to draw up a baseline assessment of what we were working with. Then the second part was extensive stakeholder engagement. So we first went to Ward 4 and we were doing an observation field trip accompanied by the Komati Steering Committee that allowed us to get a better understanding of the area and what's actually happening on the ground. After that, we did individual interviews with various stakeholders that all have done work or are doing work in some capacity in the area. And then we did an in-person focus group. So the focus group was mainly municipal officials and provincial officials that were also giving us their views. And then finally, after we did the first draft of the report, we went back to Komati and then we did a stakeholder dialogue session where we invited community members and also stakeholders that had also given their inputs, where we had over 160 attendees at this dialogue. And then the third aspect was the quantitative data analysis. Here we use the Global Policy Incubator or the GPI tool. I'll get into how that works in a few slides. So our list of stakeholders, we interviewed the Komati Steering Committee members and Indalo Inclusive, which does a lot of enterprise development in the area and supports small businesses. We spoke to Eskom and Genesis Analytics. With Genesis, it was in their capacity as an implementing agent for Eskom. We spoke to GIZ Groundwork, the IDC, which was supporting work that was done by Seriti Institute on training programs in the area. And then we also spoke to Naledi and Breadline Africa. For our focus group, we had SALGA, and then we had the Mpumalanga Green Cluster Agency, the Mpumalanga DDET, as well as the Mpumalanga Office of the Premier. And as mentioned, for the stakeholder dialogue session, we had invited mostly the community and some of the stakeholders that we had interviewed. So in terms of the Global Policy Incubator, sorry, it's the clicker. Through GIZ, we were introduced to a tool called the global policy incubator tool. And essentially what it does is that it supports policymakers to analyze the performance of existing sectors to select ones with the highest potential for growth. And then these best performing sectors, which demonstrate strong performance across specific criteria, are then given medium to long-term support to reach diversification goals. So the 5 criteria that the GPI tool uses to assess the different sectors is firstly size and dynamism of value added, employment creation, employee compensation, export potential, and import substitution. Again, just to emphasize, when using this tool, the data is based on the STIVCHA, the local municipality. So we did find that there were quite a few challenges that were hindering diversification in the area, but also there were opportunities that could be leveraged for diversification. So in terms of challenges, infrastructure was a significant challenge. Firstly, general and utilities infrastructure. This is what we found from our interviews, but also from our trips to Komati and Ward 4. The general utilities infrastructure is a challenge in terms of electricity provision, water, sanitation systems, and sewage infrastructure. So a lot of people that are in informal settlements and townships and the farming areas aren't able to access most of these services. Then another significant challenge was the transport infrastructure, as well as the digital infrastructure. So in terms of transport, this came up in 2 forms. Firstly, there isn't sufficient public transport for people to use to go in and out of the area and around the area. And the second challenge is that the public transport infrastructure is very poorly maintained. For instance, the roads are very poorly maintained. So of course that affects how the area affects investors and businesses. With digital connectivity, the issue is around access to information for the people in the area. So that's a challenge because the infrastructure around that is not very developed. And then we had a challenge, or we found a challenge around the skills gap. So the area has a long history of coal mining. So a lot of people in the area have skills that are tied to coal mining, right? So they need to be upskilled and retrained. But the challenge now is that some people have been attending programs to upskill and retrain them, but they aren't able to find job opportunities after they've completed the training. But also at the same time, there have been programs that have been implemented in the area which have started and are in progress, but people in the local economy are not able to participate because they don't have the relevant skills for those specific problems. So those are the challenges that are faced in terms of skills. And then there's a challenge in terms of access to land and property ownership. Yeah, I'm on the right slide. So most of the land is either owned by Eskom or it's under private ownership. And a lot of people don't know how to access the land for diversification activities. So that's a very significant challenge because people do have ideas in terms of what to do to create employment, but they just don't have access to some of the land. Then in terms of property ownership, there needs to be diversification in terms of ownership and control so that the market doesn't end up being dominated or controlled by a few large market players. Assets and regulatory challenges. So with assets, again, the community is uncertain about the ownership of local assets, and then this limits their participation in the economy because they don't know which resources are public and which resources are private. And also they don't really understand or know about the regulations around that. What can they do to access the land if needs be? Fortunately, there also were some opportunities. In terms of opportunities, so the World Bank had No. So land and agriculture, right? This is one of the main opportunities that we found because there's a lot of arable land in the target area. The issue is that the extent to which the land can be effectively managed depends on land rights. But we did find that a lot of people are interested in farming, specifically in vegetable cultivation, as well as cultivating maize and soybeans. So other potential pathways for economic diversification, the World Bank did announce that they'd repurpose the power station for battery storage and microgrid assembly. That remains a potential pathway. To date, as far as we know, the training for that hasn't started, so people wouldn't have the skills to be part of that program. And then there's an opportunity in localizing brick production because a lot of the construction material is sourced externally, which then obviously increases the costs, and having brick production in the area would create employment. So our key findings and recommendations. Okay, perfect. So from the GPI tool, but also from our interviews, we did identify 5 potential products and activities that could present diversification opportunities. So these are the best performing sectors that could grow at scale, but they do require medium to long-term support. So the products we've identified, the categories, cereals and oil seeds. So the production of those, which would include wheat, sorghum, soybeans, and seeds for sowing. The production of vegetable oils and oil cake, which would be soybean oil, oil cake, which is used in animal feed, and flours and meals for oil seeds. Then grain mill production, which is maize, cereal grains, rice, wheat flour, and cereal flours. And then paper and sanitary products. So that would include paper and paperboard, toilet and facial tissues, and sanitary products. And then finally, construction, which would take place in the form of mine rehabilitation, basic infrastructure, brick making, housing, and agro-processing facilities. So we then went further to identify the strategic rationale for why we've recommended these opportunities, but also the key constraints, because we have to be realistic about what's happening in the target area. We looked at what the skills and capabilities that are needed for these options are, and the investment needs as well, and also the responsible actors. So looking at cereals and oil seeds as a quick example, the strategic rationale is that it has the potential for strong export growth. It supports agro-processing, animal feed, as well as rural employment, and it is a low-risk diversification option. Responsible actors for this specific product or these products would be DALRAD, the DFFE, the DTIC, IDC, and other agribusinesses as examples. So in terms of our recommendations, they are divided into 3 phases. So phase 1 would take place over 3 years and would focus on short-term priorities and stabilization. So then this would include a worker registry and skills audit in the target area. Sorry, the slide hasn't moved. This would include a worker registry and a skills audit, the initiation of pilot projects that would be in the priority growth sectors, launching of training and skills programs, and what's important is to align them with emerging sectors, consolidating fragmented funding streams, and then also enabling investment. The upgrade of infrastructure, specifically utilities, transport, digital and social infrastructure, and then supporting rehabilitated land for productive economic use, addressing the ownership issues that I spoke to, as well as improving stakeholder engagement and public awareness. Phase 2 would take place over 6 to 8 years, and here it would be around industrial diversification acceleration. So it would be, well, one of the options would be to strengthen linkages to existing economic hubs. So where Komati is placed can prove as an opportunity because people can travel from Komati to nearby industrial hubs such as Emalahleni and Middelburg. So following the development of transport infrastructure, then there needs to be support in the businesses in Emalahleni and Middelburg so that they can create additional employment to bring in people from the target area. Then what needs to happen is supporting labor-intensive manufacturing clusters and then securing anchoring investors. And there also needs to be a big focus on SMME development. Finally, the third phase, which would take place over 10 years, this would then be the competitive low-carbon economy we envision, where export-oriented green industries are developed and the industrial clusters have matured, but also the skills transitions and innovation systems are sustained. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Ntombi, and for sharing the insights from your research. I know that the Justice A team is on the ground, doing the work and also engaging with various stakeholders. So it's really great to see some of those findings coming out. So thank you. This was our last presentation. Again, I will just take one question either from online or from the room before I move on to our discussant. If there is a question, there's a question in the room, but I just want to give the people online a chance, just in case there is someone who would like to ask a question. Any questions of clarity? Any burning questions? Anushka, you're welcome to unmute. Anushka? I'm not sure if you're speaking, but we can't hear you. Okay, I'm going to move on to Devin. Devin, you're welcome to ask your question. Please unmute. Please introduce yourself before your question. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I'm Devin Clay. I'm from the Presidential Climate Commission. Sure, when we speak about the issues around economic diversification, there's two clear, distinct pathways or streams that we need to look at. So one is consideration around existing economic opportunities that can be expanded. More particularly is what are the new economic opportunities that can be introduced in particular localities? Now, when we speak about economic diversification within the just transition ecosystem, it's around looking at economic opportunities that can absorb workers that are at risk. So in the Mpumalanga coal belt, we're looking at anything between 80,000 and 120,000 workers. And where can these workers transition to? But noting our chronic unemployment in South Africa, we want to look at opportunities that goes beyond the workers at risk. How do we absorb the unemployed into formal economy? I mean, a lot of the work that we're seeing is looking at existing opportunities, how you expand it, and growing those opportunities. That's great. I just want to, it could, and this is not to any specific presenter, but what is your thoughts around how do you expand existing opportunities? And I just want to lead with one example. I'm sorry about this. I'm hoping I'm not going to take too much of your time. But if you look at the Mpumalanga coal belt, there's a lot of photoremedial work that needs to be done to the soil in order to engage and expand in economic agricultural activities. And there's papers that has been done, PCC, Eskom, RCL Foods, etc., that speak about the introduction of particular species that can do photoremedial work. And that's a whole new economic activity that can lead to a whole new industrial opportunities within these localities. I'm not seeing those kinds of initiatives surfacing, because if we're able to surface that, then we're able to bring in the correct players to the room and have a very detailed discussion on how you realize these opportunities sooner rather than later. Thanks, Chair. So, per comment, part, just a question around what the researchers think around that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the comment, Devin, as well as for the question. So I'm just going to give an opportunity to Ndombi or Kate to respond to Devin's question, but also for some of my other colleagues to think about for our Q&A session. Ndombi? No, we can't hear you.
Okay, so I think Devin's question is a very important one which we are grappling with as we're doing research on diversifying Mpumalanga. The challenge is that we always have to consider the local context and what's actually reasonable. In our suggestions, we had a longer list of suggestions, proposals for what options or products could be diversified into, some of which were new products, right? But then when you look at what's actually happening on the ground, you have to take that into account and see is this feasible or is it pie in the sky? So I think for our work, that's the challenge that we face a lot. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Ndombi. So we have a discussant input by Mohammed, who is a senior economist at TIPS, and Mohammed will be weighing in on the presentations as well as giving some of his views on the topic. Mohammed, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone. As Lesego's mentioned, I'm Mohammed Patel. I'm an economist here at TIPS. Excuse me. And we've been working on a lot of these issues in different ways over the past couple of years. Firstly, I just want to thank all of our presenters on great presentations and inputs, really approaching this topic of diversification from different vantage points and different sort of level of analyses. What's come clear through some of the presentations in the agriculture presentations that were presented first, it's very clear that climate change is already having an impact on livelihoods. And we also see coming through that the diffusion of technology is uneven amongst stakeholders in the value chain. I think Michael mentioned this dual system that we see in South Africa, large established commercial farmers on one end, small scale farmers and farm workers on the other end. So that's clearly a challenge that faces this particular value chain. In Kate's presentation, it was very clear that tourism certainly has a role to play in Mpumalanga. Some challenges there as well in terms of where current tourism activity sits, and also importantly, it's unrealistic to expect that tourism is going to fill all of the impacts left after coal is gone. Especially given the integration of the coal value chain into some of the key municipalities that were mentioned, like Emalahleni, Diffusion, etc. From Ntombi's presentation, very interesting look at a very local study and some of the challenges that come through when you disaggregate to that level of analysis. What I found particularly encouraging was the fact that there was some sort of local level validation, so focus groups, etc., especially given some of the data limitations, which I can identify with and can be difficult when one is trying to embark on such a study. Given that, we'd also see some variances in terms of when we're thinking about economic diversification and we're thinking of different value chains. All value chains are not the same. They differ in terms of their regional intensity. So, for example, we see coal highly regionalized, right? And it's a sort of double-edged sword. It's a good and a bad thing. On one hand, because of the high regional intensity, when there are impacts to the value chain, those impacts are highly regionalized. And because coal accounts for such a high share of gross value add and employment, it means that the shocks are severe. But it's also a benefit because what it means is that we have a very, very targeted area that we need to support. That focus means that a lot of capacity, institutional capacity and other levers can be narrowed down to a very defined geographic area. When we look at tourism, for example, much more geographically distributed throughout the country, and there are some challenges around that. So with some of those reflections, I'd like to pose a few questions to our presenters. We also really want to have a lively discussion and debate, so I'm not going to take too much of time, and we'd like to, open the floor both in the room and online to questions that others and colleagues working in the space may have. But just some provisional questions. So firstly, starting off with agriculture. We see that there are a number of potential avenues for support. The mention of extension services, for example. One challenge is the ability of small-scale farmers to access, accurate climate data and information. And a number of other challenges and proposals. So if the two of you, maybe both of you can answer, if you could identify a key catalytic intervention. So what is the first thing that we need to really solve that can unlock other elements of support down the line? If you could reflect and highlight that. In terms of the tourism presentation, Kate, when you mentioned the different post-mining tourism attractions, you mentioned gold, and you also mentioned Kimberley has a big hole. Mpumalanga has a big potential hole in the future as well, and that's an economic hole, right? That's going to be left after coal is gone. I can't help but think when we did site visits some years back, there's a garage just outside of Middelburg, and there's a big sign as you're exiting the garage, and it says Middelburg, the tourism mecca of Mpumalanga. I hope that can be bigger in a more provincial way in the future. But my question to you would be, what can we, especially given your point around, we can't expect tourism to completely substitute for coal activity for many reasons. What would you say is a realistic benchmark for success in a decade? What tourism activities can we see in Mpumalanga, let's say a decade from now, that we can say, look, I think we've won with trying to diversify into tourism and Mpumalanga? I know you've mentioned a number of very detailed, proposals, etc. But if you can give your sort of frank thoughts around what success looks like for tourism diversification and Mpumalanga. And then finally, Ntombi, on your economic diversification presentation, you mentioned an interesting point about the features of coal regions. And coal regions throughout the world share some of these common features, right? One that you mentioned was a coal mining identity. Successive generations identify with coal. My grandfather was a coal miner. My dad was a coal miner. I'm a coal miner. That's my identity, along with other factors like, the wage differential, for example, the wage education premium, or what some people call it. So, given these factors, and given the importance of reskilling and retraining. And there was an interesting point that you mentioned that also made me think, and something I reflected on as well. When we were looking at green hydrogen and the ability of TVET systems to reorient towards training programs for the future, one point that came up was a real problem that was inherent in the system, and that was sort of these training dead ends. Right? So you train and reskill people, but there's not too much of thought placed on what happens after. Then you get people entering or trying to enter the labor market with skills that are ill-equipped or ill-matched with the jobs that are available. So how can we think about, in more detail, sort of avoiding those training dead ends when we're thinking of repurposing, reskilling, and retraining? So those are just some reflections. I have lots of questions that I could ask, but I don't want to deprive our audience as well. So I think we can kick off with that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mohammed, for sharing your reflections and for the questions. So I'd like to give an opportunity to our panelists to address some of Mohammed's questions. But before I do that, Etienne, I want to give you an opportunity to give some of your reflections and ask a question. And then after that, after the questions are answered, we'll have 2 rounds of questions, hopefully, before we close. So Etienne, over to you, and then after that, to our panelists. You're welcome to
Great.
unmute.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much for the presentations and for arranging this webinar. I think it's an opportune time. Thank you. I'm very worried about Mpumalanga and with the transition, because we've got 80,000 people who work there, and all those jobs will no longer be there when all the coal disappears. Now, I'm on a panel advising the Minister of the DFFE on what they should do about Eskom and the pollution that's been created in Mpumalanga. And as part of that, we did a 2,000-kilometer trip around Mpumalanga. And what I saw was there's coal and there's absolutely nothing else. It actually wants to it makes me want to cry. But there's a Pick and Pay, yes, there's a Checkers, but it's because of the coal mines that those industries are there. So what are those 80,000 people going to do when the coal mines are closed? Now, there's one thing you can do is reskilling, retraining. But like Mohammed was saying, is it's going to be dead-end jobs or dead-end training if you don't create industry and employment and agriculture there to use those jobs. So how do we as South Africans get industry to come to Mpumalanga? One thing I was thinking of when you did this trip, the thing I was thinking of is agriculture, because from a tourism point of view, unfortunately, it's not the prettiest part of the world and it's polluted. So I think there will be challenges for tourism. But what's nice about agriculture is you can start with small scale, and as you grow, you can become more commercial, more large scale farming. And also from a skill set, it's easier to go from being a coal miner to car tractors, which you maintain. And so it's an easier place to transfer your skills. Just how do we get industry to come to Mpumalanga? We need that. Retraining is not going to be enough. Thanks.
Thanks, Etienne. Jill, we can start with you.
Thanks, Mohammed. So I think for me, one of the key catalytic interventions is definitely upscaling public-private partnerships. We've already seen one by Green SA, the Farmer-Centered Innovation Systems. And I think in one of the research, DFFE said it would be one of those examples they would scale up. And I say this because the private sector has a lot of R&D and R&D in-house. And if we map some of the government agri-hubs and just where they are, also looking at the number of small-scale farmers and households, all the shortfalls is where maybe the private sector can also come in, so that in each region, at least it's evenly distributed. And also the large-scale farmers have really moved forward, and also just having some of those experimental learning experiences with small-scale farmers around them. And then lastly, I'm not too sure on if hemp can grow in Mpumalanga, but, you know, there's been a lot of effort in trying to also create jobs in the cannabis and hemp master plan. And, you know, that goes towards clothing because of the polluted soil. And so I think those are some of the things just to look at. If it's polluted non-food uses in agriculture, that could also go into, for example, textiles. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill. Michael?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So in terms of sort of unlocking support to Mohammed's question, so within the SJRP and the AIM's deep dive, I actually started looking into what is being done internationally, and it's what seems as simple programs. I still need to, obviously, the deep dive is still undergoing, so I still need to look into it a little bit further. But in Brazil, for example, they've got a procurement program for small scale, what they call family farms. And I think it's farms that are like 10 hectares or something like that, where government is, its policy to be or required to purchase food and agri-products from these small-scale or family farms to supply public hospitals, schools, etc. Right? But a lot of the issues that I do see in terms of small-scale farms providing support is that there's a lack of focus on improving local infrastructure, which I think it's a starting point. And that also ties into economically diversifying those areas, right? But for me, the primary focus is on farm workers, as we see in the NEVA and in the SJRP. It outlines the skills levels of farm workers, and a lot of these jobs are occupied by elementary work or low skilled in layman's terms. And then also education levels are also pretty much low. So we are seeing the difficulty in transitioning those workers. As mentioned earlier, and it's easier to go from, say, a coal mine to working on or fixing a tractor, for example. But a greater focus needs to be given to tech changes within the agri sector, equipping farm workers with skills that relate to climate change, things like water management, for example, adapting to climate change, and also considerations around perhaps relooking protection, because I know recently from a PMG report, we still see high levels of discrimination, high levels of rights being refused on some farms in relation to farm workers. So equipping these farm workers with skills that they can, in the event that climate change gets so bad, that they can transition to, for example, food processing, which is one of the considerations that the deep dive takes, is looking at redeployment. I know it's very much common in the coal sector, for example. But once again, it comes back to skills, the basic level literacy rate, reading and writing, etc. So in terms of farm workers, that's where support needs to start. Thanks.
All right, Mohammed, you asked about how we can think about it, addressing the challenges of reskilling. So I think the question can be answered in two layers. Firstly, in terms of workers that have already been affected, such as in Komati, there is research that we're working on under Just SA on developing a just transition worker policy package. And I think that research looks at the skills that people need in order to transition to other industries. And then investing in research and development on what the market needs, that's another point. And I think that needs to be context specific. So now this answers both the first layer and the second layer. So in terms of addressing challenges of reskilling in areas like Komati, I think the starting point would be to conduct a skills audit and see what can people already do, and then align opportunities with the skills that they have. And of course, something that's been mentioned before is having TVETs and other educational institutions aligning their curriculum with skills that are needed. And something that we don't talk enough about is having sustainability education in primary school, starting in primary school, so that children grow up understanding what does a just transition mean, what does a green economy mean. And then Etienne asked, how do we get industry to come to Mpumalanga? So unfortunately, Etienne, I actually don't have an answer for you, but when we do visit Mpumalanga, particularly training local and provincial government officials, we do go through a process of thinking about identifying green opportunities in the province. And one of the things we ask them is, what are the assets that they have versus the liabilities they have? And then we always ask, how can Mpumalanga be differentiated from other provinces so that it becomes more competitive and more attractive to investors? So I do think that it's something that they're already thinking about at those levels. And we do encourage officials that we train to think about that sort of thing. Thanks.
Thanks, Ntombi. Kate, any response to Mohammed's question?
Yeah, maybe Titan as well. Obviously, leisure is not the short-term or even medium-term target. I think that I accept the point around you know, the area is too polluted. But what we do see is that you already have an active domestic tourism economy, and you have towns with some money in them. And so really thinking about how one activates better recreation and domestic experiences, Mohammed, within 10 years, and that begins like some of these emerging tourism clusters. Now, Ermelo and Christie's Me are very interesting. They're entrepreneurs, they're already doing it, but they're kind of doing it alone. They're not getting much support. So maybe some funding for industry associations who have ideas around events and attractions to build happening already. And that's a less polluted part of the country that has quite a lot to offer. And then seeing the cultural heritage sites that are currently government and government agency mandates to manage, seeing those being properly restored and looking at perhaps better visitor experiences there. It is so one of the things that part of the province does offer that would like distinguish it from the sort of eco-tourism in the east of Mpumalanga. So I think those are two places I think more could be done. And then the third critical one would be really around the dams, which already are a site of recreation, and how one creates better visitor experiences that are more inclusive, more diverse. You can access other than if you live on the dam. I think that could be an interesting opportunity.
All right, thank you, Kate. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions. I'll start with the room. Please do introduce yourself. Before your question.
Hello. Yep. That's okay. Thank you. My name is Ndobefuthi Mazibuko. I'm from Eskom. I'm very keen on the work that's been done around Komati Power Station and Steve Twete at large. So my few questions is, I think that the speaker from Zoom actually outlined the problem very nicely. We need to find a way to get industry to come to Mpumalanga. Actually, that's the bottom line. So juxtaposed against these issues that you've outlined here, and Dombi, I'll call him Dombi, is the fact that, 20% of the population around Mpumalanga and Steve Twete specifically relies on the informal sector. And that informal sector is linked to the coal value chain, be it even the power station generation. What happens to that sector? We need to be thinking about that informal sector as we look at economic diversification. Secondly, in terms of the farming, yes, I agree, vegetables being identified. So what we've done, we started a community gardens project in Komati, but guess what we're struggling with, Dombi, with access to markets. Now they have the vegetables, the nice vegetables, but then the next closest place is Middelburg, but getting them to really get take off for those vegetables is a challenge. So we also need to think about that. How do we connect the supply to the market is also a challenge that we are faced with. My third one was, how were your discussions with Steve Twete local municipality in terms of them stepping in with the infrastructure? Because as said here, I think the challenge also starts in terms of the limited infrastructure in these areas. Oh, my very last one is getting a manufacture cluster around Komati is very tricky, because the manufacturing is actually stabilized in your Emalahleni. So we did look at a project where we were thinking about that, and it becomes very difficult. How are you going to move everyone from looking at Emalahleni to coming to these semi-rural areas? And I cannot echo your sentiments more. It's vast tracts of land with nothing but the coal or power station activities, and it's very difficult to move. How do we get this industry to move to these areas? But thank you for the research. I think it's very critical in terms of moving the interventions and opportunities forward. I think it's very critical Thank you.
Dumelang bagaetsho. My name is Dr. Murakani Madiba, and I'm a realist, transdisciplinary researcher and entrepreneur from UNISA. And the reason why I've introduced myself in that manner, in the field that I'm working in, I'm in the space of just energy transition, but I'm looking at rhetorics around in policies and as well as actual things that are happening on the ground. And I enjoyed the presentations, but in many cases I was very, very confused because I'm a realist assessor. So in the Kate's one, I'll start with the Kate's. It's not a question, but it's something that maybe we need to reflect on moving forward in research and as well as in academia. In Kate's presentation, I have a concern about, the frequent use of the term potential jobs in research, and research often makes assumptions about the number of jobs that could possibly be created. However, potential jobs are not the same as real jobs. So where I'm going with this is that South Africa is currently facing a very serious unemployment crisis, especially among young people and graduates. And what they currently needs is not potential employment, but actual jobs. Therefore, unemployment in South Africa is not a possible or future problem. It is a real and growing crisis that affects many people in everyday life. And I'm not only addressing Kate here, it's just in general. Like when we speak of potential, we must understand the realities in societies, that when research focuses mainly on the number of potential jobs and as well as the opportunities, it can create the impression that progress is being made, even when people remain unemployed. For this reason, research needs to be beyond showing what might happen and begin to contribute to creating real employment opportunities. Otherwise, it risks becoming disconnected from the realities faced by societies. And a more honest starting point would be to acknowledge that there are no jobs and there are no opportunities. And why I'm saying that is that, and it might be the way of me understanding the presentation as with its sequence that Dr. Mike spoke about. And I started asking myself, is this a desktop research, or is it informed by empirical data that is current? And when I looked at the policy reviews and stuff, and I asked, he spoke about farm workers, unemployment and opportunities. And at the same time, he spoke of low qualification. I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to grasp from his presentation. And then Gillian comes in and speaks about these technologies, and then now it's farmers. So is it a continuation, or we are done with the farm workers? Because now when we speak of technologies and this new technologies, and we are now in farmers, and at the same time we speak of the concept of innovation, who must be innovating between the farmer and the farm worker, and as well as what assumptions do we have about this in real terms, not in desktop, in whatever. And then now, then Ausi Kamo.
Ntombi.
Yes, Ausi Ntombi, yes, Ausi Ntombi. Then he speaks about a whole lot of things that are very interesting, that are on the ground. But at the same time, then I got confused that the research at in the beginning, there was 4,000 participants and it wasn't enough, then 10,000 participants. Okay, awesome. And then I asked myself, when you increase the numbers of people, what are the implications of that and generalization of that? Then she mentioned something very interesting, that in the stakeholder engagement of some sort, there were 160 people. Then I got confused. 160, are they representing 4,000, 10,000? And what does that mean? And yeah, so those are the things that I thought maybe they don't require an answer for now.
All right.
It's something that I'm saying that we need to reflect about, that when we speak about transition, especially just transition, it's about justice. And the implications of that, when we create all this data, are we doing it for research or truly transformation on the ground? So those are the questions, the reflections that I have. It's not a question as such. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the reflections and for the questions. We also received some questions online, so I'm going to read 3 of them, and then I'll give our panelists a chance to respond. So the first question is by Sekutlani. And it asks fragmentation of data. What kinds of data sets are required in short and medium term, and what would it take to build them? So I think this question is addressed to the first two presenters, Michael and Gillian. The second question is by Kirsten, and she asks, is there potential to coordinate how mine rehabilitation funds are applied to have a jobs benefit? For example, could a partnership where mining companies would agree to put some of the money towards a working on rehabilitation public employment program work? And then the third question is by Ndombi, and she asks, after extended periods of mining, how viable is the post-mining land and quality of the soil for agriculture? So I'll give an opportunity for any of our panelists to respond to those questions. Michael?
Yeah, just on the first set of reflections, so I could have perhaps made it clearer in the presentation. So the sector job resilience plans, it's a set of proposals based on findings from the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment. And that assessment outlined farm workers as vulnerable, including, and also small-scale farmers and households in historic labor-sending regions. The SJRP specifically, as in the name, jobs, focuses on the farm workers themselves. One of the set of proposals is climate adaptation. And part of this, and it's something we need to take into sort of combination, is small-scale farmers also, the tendency is to think that, okay, there's only farm workers on commercial farms, but this is farm workers on small-scale farms. And if those farms are impacted, people are going to lose their jobs. And that was the focus from the tech side, looking at what those small-scale farmers are facing. So it's a set of papers with a couple of them looking more deeper into some of the SJRP proposals. If that makes it a little bit more clear, and they will be uploaded onto the TIPS website. In terms of the kinds of data, specifically from the SJRPs, what I do see, and also the NEVAs, what I do see the issue around trying to find data in terms of what municipalities specifically are impacted by floods and to what scale, and having access to that information, especially from small-scale farmer side. And then also in terms of the vulnerable groups, so we've identified farm workers, but we know seasonal farm workers, we had this discussion yesterday of, are they moving between farms? So it's very on the ground types of data, or are they just working seasonally on one farm? So we need to understand at the sort of micro level what these farm workers are doing, what can be done to improve, how remote are these areas, how far is the next hospital, for example, those sort of things, in addition to very specific climatic data around droughts, floods, etc. And having small-scale farmers having access to those sets of data is very important, because it obviously influences when they harvest, when they plant, and so forth. Thanks.
I'll just respond to some of the questions. So someone asked on access to markets, and an example I loved was in aquaculture, because during COVID, there was really no imports or exports happening. And what some of the farms did was then create an app that linked them to your Pick n Pays, fishmongers, and up until now, they've actually been sort of supplying these retailers. So it just started in a crisis, and then they were able to open markets. And I just thought, with the government clinics, government hospitals, government prisons, as well as retail, I think there was an app I saw on one of that's just trying to link small scale farmers or even households to markets around them. So that's one. And then obviously you don't want to have spoilage. And that's when also your post-harvest innovation and tech comes in, with the solar dryers and the ethylene covers that prevent ethylene from from fruits from over-ripening. So that's just the one case. And I think a big one for me is the issue of the fragmented data. You have big international organizations like the World Bank collecting data on R&D in agro-processing, for example. And then you have academia. So you have your master's students, your PhD students who also use farms as test beds for their research. Then you also have large NGOs. Then you also have government. And all of this, for me, it's sort of like slices of pizza. And we can't see it together in one big circle. And so I really do think there needs to be effort to actually collate all this data, because I believe there's a lot happening, but it's in pockets. Not that there are things not happening, they are there. And that's where the fragmentation I'm talking about comes in. But I also want to highlight that also on government, they collect data for large-scale farmers and commercial farmers. I think if we look on Stats SA, you will see the census on commercial farmers. And already there is existing infrastructure, the CESTI DSI one, that looks exactly at innovation in agriculture and agro-processing. So far, it only looks at large-scale farmers and large agribusinesses, but I do think there is scope now to start implementing it and using it to get some of this data on the small scale farmers. And then lastly, I know DOA rolled out the farmers registration app. And I think it's a step in the right direction to also kind of get who's actually producing what. Because if you actually go online and type how many small scale farmers in South Africa, it's quite shocking. It's just so different numbers. There's no one specific one because there's no one collecting data on that. And think about it, you have the word emerging farmer, black scale farmers, small scale farmers, smallholders, what's it called? Small agricultural households. And so there's just so many little names going around, and to collate and actually say who qualifies for what here. So I do think we actually have to go back to basics as well and just leverage some of the government infrastructure already collecting data on large scale farmers and also implement it on the small scale farmers. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill.
Thanks for the questions. I'll start with Domfuti. In terms of speaking to the Steve Tshwete local municipality, we were not able to secure an interview with them. We did hear in multiple interviews that we have to speak with them, but to date, we have not been able to. And then the industrial cluster in Komati, I think it may have not come across clearly that that's a long-term vision. In the shorter term, the answer to the question is in investing in Middleburg and Emalahleni to create more jobs so that people are able to travel from Komati to those industrial hubs. And then Doc in the corner, sorry, I didn't get your name. I know you were making a comment, but I wanted to answer because in case it was unclear to other people as well. When I referred to 4,000 people, it was 4,000 people that make up the population of Komati. And then 10,000 people referred to the population of Ward 4. So our interviews were only limited to the names I listed on the slides. We didn't speak to 4,000 or 10,000 people. Thanks.
Kate, any responses from your side?
No, no, thanks, Chair.
All right, so going to do a very quick second round of questions. I think I'll take one question from the room as well as one question online. Nico, I see your hand is up. You're more than welcome to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you very much. Good day, colleagues. It's Nico Sihlangu from Nehao. Just want to ask, and also maybe as a comment at the same time, I'm just wondering, are there efforts, or what are the efforts that maybe that are being done, to bring business to these sites for them to indicate, to also do their own feasibility study to indicate whether they can enterprise in these sites or not? Because I think it's very important for industry or for business to actually be very involved in this process, to actually conduct feasible studies to find out if they can actually do enterprise, to enterprise in those areas. And then we will be able to actually also from our side, even as civil society, to estimate, to say how many jobs could be created in those sites. For example, we talk about business from tourism sector, we talked about agriculture. So even with the meeting that we are having like this one, I think with a meeting like this one could also be beneficial if such engagements could be offered to business, to people, or to those who are actually active in enterprising. So I just wanted to ask, and also with a meeting like this one, if business could be invited, or meetings like these ones could be conducted specifically for business, it could help where business maybe could also be offered or to be explained to them, to say, if you can enterprise in these areas, for example, just an example, hypothetically, access to land could be offered to you rent-free, something like that, when we now will be talking about incentives. Because in adding to what we are doing already with the good researches that are here, I think adding business as part of the primary work would actually help. So I just wanted to find out if maybe there are efforts towards that, or if they are there, what kind of efforts are there, so that we get to know on time whether business will be able to enterprise in these areas, or the government will need to now have strategies to say we can do something from the government side. But yeah, so I just want to find out from that standpoint. So I think it's important for us to know whether business see this as a potential enterprising area, or so that we can actually maybe change strategy or add on our strategy to also have government think on or government agencies to do something different. Just wanted to know from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comment and question, Nico. Question in the room? Okay, Chere.
I think I just want to focus on the question of SMMEs. One question. Okay. I think yes, SMMEs, and saying we must diversify. One of the key components of just transition is changing, especially from trade unions who seem opposed to the idea of the way the just transition is going, is transforming how the economy operates. We deal with a lot of economic inequality. When we're talking about the private sector coming in to diversify, are we looking into making sure that we're not reproducing those inequalities whereby Black people are only workers? And also, how about supporting SMMEs by making sure that people have buying power? When you're talking about food wastage, if people cannot afford to buy food, those SMMEs, those small farmers, whether they are individual or they're from cooperatives, there'll still be a challenge of who buys. Is there support? Shouldn't you also expand and deep dive into those kind of areas? Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, for your question. So we have 5 minutes left, and I'd like to give an opportunity to our panelists to close. So final remarks, as well as maybe responding to some of the questions that have been asked. I would like to start online. So Kate, I will like to start with you first, and then we'll end with Mohammed, who was our discussant. Thanks.
Thanks. Let me say something about the private sector. I think that was the first question. So where I see potential in the short term for expansion of tourism as it exists in the coalfields would be in supporting existing entrepreneurs who want to do more, and who would need access to finance and or support to get the industry associations moving so they can collectively achieve more in terms of marketing the regions they're in. That is probably where you're going to see the best luck for tourism, which is largely SMMEs, and where obviously having some access to land tends to be quite important. You can build out other parts of the tourism value chain once you have experiences, but experiences have to be in place. And that's why I said, I think Ermelo and Chrissy's Mere, for example, in particular, where the people who are trying to get things going could be a place to start. But yes, I think tourism is very private sector driven, so one would need to support what's happening on the ground. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Joe?
So my concluding remarks is, please can you go on the TIPS website? TIPS has done a couple of subsector studies across food, horticulture, wood, plastics. So there's a component that looks at technological advances, and I think it's also important to look at that as a driver into diversification strategies, as well as there's also a paper for all the industry on sustainability. So I think both of them would be a very good help in just some of these discussions. Thanks.
Thanks. So for me, it's when we look at economic diversification, especially of the farm towns in like Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, etc., we need not only look at creating opportunities, but also looking at improving local infrastructure, because a lot of these municipalities are struggling, and climate change is only going to make it a lot worse, and this is going to negatively impact, especially on farm workers. So in combination of diversifying these farm towns, we also need to start focusing on having climate responsive skills, especially for farm workers. So in the event that climate tech and things like that, as they become more popular and more implemented, that they are able to adapt to any changes within the sector.
I just want to quickly answer Nico. In terms of enterprise development, earlier we spoke about fragmented data. There's also fragmented programs because in doing our research, we do find that there are some organizations that are supporting enterprise development, one of which is Indalo Inclusive. We interviewed them in our study. In my opinion, I do think it would help if programs like that were expanded or rolled out at a much bigger scale. But of course, funding is always a challenge. And then in terms of who can attend the learning events, as far as I know, they're open to anyone to attend. Yeah, thanks.
Mohammed, you want to come in? Yeah, you can.
Okay, thanks. As we bring the session to a close, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending in person and online today. A great series of presentations exploring, a very important issue as we think about the transition of our economy towards a lower carbon and sustainable format. I think as a sort of undercurrent that flows through all of this is, and I think one or two questions mentioned it, was the idea of the just part of transition, right? So, when we think about a future, we know that South Africa exists in a given developmental context, and we have a number of constraints, that determine our future path. But like we've seen in a number of presentations here today, there are opportunities for diversification specifically. Diversification is not the only tool in the toolbox, so to speak, when we think about the transition, but it's certainly part of it. And we do require a number of other supportive tools, like active labor market policies, for example, the importance of reskilling and retraining into sustainable jobs or positions for which there is demand for labor. And with that vein, it's going to take really a cohesive package of tools to get to the position where we have a lower carbon industrial and energy base. We have higher employment in our economy, and we have less inequality and less poverty. So given that context, I'd like to thank everyone. We will share all of the presentations that have been made today. Colleagues have mentioned as well in their presentations some reports and research projects that people are working on. If you have any questions or doubts, please feel free to contact our admin team. They'll direct you to the relevant researcher or to the relevant page on our website so that you can access some of these documents. Just finally, in closing, something that's just itching a bit was the question around, so if businesses want to get involved in activities, how do they even start to think about this? The good news is that there are some quite ambitious activities in Mpumalanga trying to investigate, what are new opportunities, where can businesses plug in. Two perhaps stakeholders I'd like to highlight just briefly. One would be, there are local chambers of commerce. So we know, for example, the Middelburg Chamber of Commerce has been quite proactive in terms of looking at new business opportunities for businesses within Middelburg. So if you are a business looking for opportunities, that might be one port of call. The other is the Mpumalanga Green Cluster, which was set up a number of years ago, but last year, signed an official memorandum of understanding with the presidency, to have a sort of secretariat position within Mpumalanga. So if one goes to their website, you'll find different types of market intelligence reports trying to investigate, different avenues or areas of economic interest and potential, like soil remediation that was mentioned here, wastewater treatment, etc., etc. So that's another avenue that one could explore as well. When we look at Eskom decommissioning, often there's RFPs put out or other types of proposals that are put out. So interested businesses could also keep a check on those dynamics. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to close and thank you everyone for attending today. Ciao.